Hi everyone, I hope you're doing well today. So last time we looked at presenting the problem of evil, the logical problem of evil. Well, in this presentation, I want to introduce a common response that I'm going to refer to as the greater good strategy. So in this video, we're going to briefly review what the logical argument from evil is. Then we'll talk about, well, what would a theist need to resolve that problem? And then we'll introduce the greater good strategy. And then we'll talk about we'll outline the strategy, and we'll talk about some of the analogies that are sometimes used as a way to try to support the strategy. And then we'll talk about some problems with those analogies. Then that'll lead us into a discussion of the burdens of a greater good strategy. And this will have to do with the discussion from our dialogue about the Barber case, and we'll distinguish between what's sometimes called a theodicy and a defense. So the idea of this video is to make sure we understand what the logical problem is, and we understand what the greater good strategy is, and finally, get clear about what exactly, what requirements, what standards a theist would have to meet in order to defend their belief from this charge of irrationality due to this worry about a logical contradiction. All right, so the simple version of the logical argument from evil is as follows. If God exists, then evil would not exist. It's impossible for both to exist at the same time. Clearly, evil does exist, thus God does not exist. So this is a modus tollens argument. If A, then B, not B, therefore not A. It's deductively valid, and that means in order for the theist to get out of the problem, in order for them to get out of this worry that there's a sort of problem that shows that their belief is irrational, they have to sort of deny one of these premises. And they have to figure out how to rationally deny one of these premises. Now, the fuller version of the logical argument from evil goes as follows. It tries to sort of cash out exactly how the contradiction arises that's being suggested in the first premise of the simpler version. That is, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. So those are the traditional theistic ideas. Well, if God is omniscient, then God knows about any evil. So we're connecting omniscience to evil. If God is omnipotent, then God has the power to prevent any evil, making a connection between omnipotence and evil. And if God is omnibenevolent, then God would want to prevent any evil. And again, bringing in omnibenevolence and connecting it up to claims about evil. Well, if God knows about any evil, has the power to prevent any evil, and wants to prevent any evil, then no evil would exist. Well, evil does exist, therefore God does not exist. Yet again, this is essentially a more complicated modus tollens argument that also uses some hypothetical syllogisms, but what you need to know is the argument is deductively valid. If those premises are true, then the conclusion is true. And so if someone wants to defend the belief in God from this charge of irrationality, they need to figure out how they can rationally reject one of these premises. Notice that the problem involves two beliefs that the theist accepts. The first is their belief that God exists, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, and their belief that evil exists. Because, again, we all pretty much believe that evil exists. And in fact, the existence of evil is a very important part of theism. If someone denied that evil exists, that would seem to rob religious stories of any sort of significance or meaning. So evil and God are both beliefs that are really important to the picture that theism is drawing. The problem is that these two beliefs appear to be inconsistent. In other words, it looks like they can't both be true. So here's a question, though. Does responding to this problem require giving a proof that God really exists? Because as we've seen, that would be really hard. We looked at the cosmological argument, we looked at the design argument, and both of those had some pretty big problems. And so if you had to convince someone that God exists to get out of this problem, it looks like that's going to be a difficult task. Thankfully, that's not what a theist would need to do in order to reply to this problem. The theist only needs to show how it's possible for both God and evil to exist at the same time. If they did that, they would show that their beliefs are not inconsistent. And so they would have defended themselves from this charge that their beliefs are irrational due to the inconsistency. Now, many students, when they hear this, they think, of course, that's ridiculously easy. You just want me to show the possibility of God and evil? So show how it's possible that a perfect God would allow evil? Well, that seems like absurdly easy. And they tend to appeal to the following kind of strategy. It's what I call the greater good strategy. They say, look, a perfect God doesn't want any evil or suffering to occur. But people, even good people, are justified in allowing evil or suffering to occur when that's necessary to either gain some greater good or to avoid some greater evil or suffering. All right. So we might think, well, what premise from the argument from evil is this greater good strategy attacking? Well, let's look at that simple version of the argument. Well, the idea is premise 1 would be false. It says, well, look, even if a perfect God exists, that perfect God still might allow that evil, since doing so might be necessary to get a greater good or to avoid an even worse evil. So they don't want that to happen, but they need to allow it to happen to get that greater good. Or take the full version. The premise that they'd be denying here would be premise number 5. This says, if God knows about any evil, has a power to prevent that evil, and wants to prevent that evil, then no evil would exist. The idea seems to be like, look, God might want to prevent the evil, and God might have the power to prevent it and might know about it, but God might also know that if God were to prevent the evil, that would just lead to either something worse later on, or it would prevent something even really awesome happening later on. And so even though God doesn't want that evil to occur and could prevent it, God decides not to, so as to make sure that that greater good later on, or the worse evil later on, doesn't occur. All right, and so they're denying premise 5. They're saying even if God knows about it, has a power to prevent it, and wants to prevent it, God might still allow it if it's necessary for that greater good. All right, so whether this defense is successful depends upon the following. Is it truly possible for there to be a greater good that would give justifying reason for a perfect God to allow evil and suffering to occur in a world? All right, now, this is actually harder. This possibility is a lot harder to show than you might think. All right, so if you show that this is possible, then there's no inconsistency in believing both that a perfect God and evil coexist. And so a theist would avoid this supposed logical problem in their beliefs. Notice, they wouldn't have shown that God does exist. They would just show that they're not involved in any logical contradiction. And so they're avoiding that charge of irrationality. Now, if this is impossible, then the logical problem still stands. So if we cannot come up with a possible way that there would be a greater good that would give God a justifying reason to allow evil and suffering, well, then there's still a contradiction. So, why should we believe that there is a possible greater good that could explain why a perfect God would allow evil? Well, one might try to show the possibility of a greater good to the evil we see in the world by appealing to a variety of analogies. That's how Dave Cohen and Miller start out in the dialogue. So they're meant to represent the theist and the agnostic as well. But they say, consider these analogies. There's an aesthetic analogy where they consider a book. So an ugly patch in a painting can make the whole painting more beautiful than it would have been without that ugly patch. Or a boring chapter in a novel can make the whole book better than it would have been without the boring chapter. Or a discordant note in a symphony can make the whole symphony better than it would have been without the note. So a bad part can often make the whole better than it would have been without that part. Similarly, as an analogy, we should believe that an evil or bad part or suffering in our world could make the world better as a whole. So when we zoom out and see the bigger picture, so to speak, than it would have been without the evil. So on that sort of view, a perfect God would want to create the better world. And if the better world as a whole is the world with sort of a part that is evil or has suffering, well, then God would allow that suffering since it exists inside this greater whole. The book also gives a fishing analogy. So Miller says, think of the times we go fishing. Surely it's some form of mild suffering to get out of bed before dawn on a chilly Nebraska spring morning when one might sleep in. But the days as a whole, the days that start out with those unpleasant experiences, are some of the most enjoyable days one can imagine. The point was that perhaps even a perfect day can contain a part that isn't that much fun, that might even qualify as a bit of suffering, and the blend of misery and pleasure doesn't have to do with the effect on some outsider who watches and appreciates this combination at work, as in the cases of the novel and the picture. It's the participants whose own lives are better in virtue of their own misery who matter. Just as we have a plan for spending a fine day fishing that has, as a necessary part, a little suffering early in the morning, so God may have a plan for the world that requires suffering. It still may be a fine world, a much better world than it would have been without the suffering. All right, so the idea is, just like in the fishing case, yes, we experience some pain and suffering, but that pain and suffering is still necessary to achieve the good result of a sort of perfect fishing day, so to speak. Because we can't get, so since the fish bite early in the morning, is if we didn't get out of bed, we wouldn't have gotten the pleasure of that fishing day. And so we need to go through that suffering in order to achieve that greater good of fishing. Now, I understand the suffering of getting out of bed early. I don't really understand the pleasure of fishing because I don't enjoy fishing, but hopefully you get the point. All right, so there's also a parenting analogy that's oftentimes given that your book doesn't mention. So consider, sometimes I bring my daughter to get vaccination shots, even though this causes her to feel fear and some physical pain. I mean, I think it's clear my daughter suffers when she gets a vaccination. However, this is the fact that I bring her to get the vaccination, that I allow this pain and suffering. That's consistent with the fact that I love her, that I don't want her to feel that fear or that pain, and also that I'm a good parent. So the fact that I bring her to that vaccination, the fact that I allow her to feel that fear and that physical pain, that doesn't whatsoever diminish my sort of quality, my morality as a parent. The reason I'm justified in allowing this suffering as a parent is because it is necessary in order to achieve the greater good of protecting her from viruses that can cause even worse suffering in her life later on. And so the idea here is, look, if I took away this suffering of the vaccination, the idea is I'd also take away the greater good of protecting her from those other viruses that would cause worse suffering. And so I'm justified in allowing her this small evil or suffering so as to get that greater good, since I couldn't get the greater good without it. Unfortunately, these analogies do not successfully support the greater good strategy. They don't show that it really is possible for there to be a greater good that would justify God in allowing evil to exist. So in the aesthetic analogy, this is because aesthetic value isn't relevantly analogous to genuine suffering. The way Ryra puts this in the article, or in the dialogue, is she says, look, in a book, the characters, they are just there for someone else's entertainment. The sort of badness or value is purely subjective. It has to do with how someone else reacts to that sort of case. Similarly, in a painting or a symphony, the value of a symphony or of a book or of a painting comes from the person that's observing the painting. The whole point of a painting or suffering, the purpose is to entertain someone else. But our lives, we're not just mere playthings for someone else's observations. We actually experience, we're not just a character in a novel that's being described as suffering. No, we are characters in a novel, and we experience, we're not characters in a novel. We actually experience and feel that pain and suffering. And that suffering is bad regardless of how it is perceived by someone else. There's a kind of objective badness to that pain and suffering. The fishing and parenting analogies also fail because this proves the possibility that a human could be justified in allowing an evil to achieve a greater good, because our power to achieve the good results is limited by the way the world works. Look, it's just the way the world works that there is disease, and we have vaccinations, and unfortunately, I live in a world where that's the only way to help avoid those diseases. And I live in a world where giving a shot causes pain, and I don't have any control over that. And since I don't have any control of that, it is necessary for me, if I want to get the greater good of protecting my daughter, I need to have her go through that pain of the vaccination. Similarly, look, the way that our world works is that, fish bite early in the morning, apparently. I had no idea till I read this that was the case. And so just given the way the world works, if you want to have a sort of day fishing where you're going to catch fish, then you need to get up early. That's just the way the world is, and so you got to deal with it. And so you might be justified in going through that sort of minor bit of suffering in order to get the greater good. But notice, the reason that that pain and suffering is necessary is because we are limited by how the world works. But those limits do not apply to God. God is supposed to be all-powerful. God is not limited by the way the world works. God chooses the way the world works. God chooses to create a world where the fish bite sort of early. God chooses to create a world where sort of Rob doesn't like getting up early. God chooses to create a world where, vaccines cause pain, shots cause pain. And so the idea here is, look, when you say, hey, here's a greater good that comes from this evil, well, that wouldn't provide justification. That wouldn't explain how it's possible for God, a perfect God, to allow evil, because presumably an all-powerful God would have the power to achieve those good results without allowing the evil. God is not limited by the way cause and effect work in this world, since God creates cause and effect, according to the theist. So that evil wouldn't be necessary for God to get the good results, even if it's necessary for us to get those good results. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, so the analogies aren't perfect, but don't they at least show that there's a general way to show how God might allow evil? There might be some greater good that we're just unaware of that makes God and evil consistent, that shows that there's some bigger picture where those two things can go together, even if we can't see that bigger picture. Isn't that good enough to respond to the problem? No. Because all that says is maybe the belief in God and evil are consistent, even though we have no idea how they could be consistent, even though everything we've said so far seems to suggest that they're not consistent. So this doesn't prove that it's even possible for the theist belief to be true. So it's not just that this maneuver doesn't show what God's actual reasons are. It's that this maneuver doesn't even show it's possible for God to have reasons to allow evil. So what more then is required to show that this is possible? It is, you must identify a specific possible situation where there's a greater good justifying a perfect God and allowing evil. Notice, I don't say that you have to identify God's actual reasons for allowing evil, but at the very least, to show that it's possible for God and evil to exist, you have to identify a possible reason where God would allow at least some evil. So to illustrate, Rob gives an analogy. Imagine you believe that there exists a barber who, A, shaves all the residents of Tuskegee who do not shave themselves, and B, does not shave anyone else. Now imagine someone then argues that your belief in such a barber is irrational because these beliefs are inconsistent. They can't both be true. So it's just like the problem of evil. They take two beliefs and they say, look, those beliefs are inconsistent, and so your beliefs are irrational. Well, the person might give the following reason and say, well, look, those beliefs are inconsistent, and here's why. If the barber does not shave themselves, then it appears that A is false, because there's someone who doesn't shave themselves that the barber doesn't shave. But if the barber does shave themselves, then it looks like B is false, because it looks like they shave someone other than those people who don't shave themselves. All right, so it looks like no matter what the barber does, whether they shave themselves or don't shave themselves, it looks like one of those claims is going to be wrong. All right, now, you can't respond, you can't defend the rationality of your belief in such a barber by saying, oh, look, maybe there's some bigger story where both these things could be true. But you could prove that your beliefs are consistent by pointing out the following. It's possible that the barber is a resident of Auburn who drives to Tuskegee and shaves every resident who doesn't shave themselves, and this barber doesn't shave themselves. Well, A would be true in this imaginary situation because they're shaving all the residents of Tuskegee who don't shave themselves, and B would be true because they don't shave anybody else. Now notice, to show that these beliefs, that the belief in such a barber is consistent, you don't need to tell me where the barber really lives. All you have to do, maybe you have no idea. Maybe they live in Tuskegee, maybe they don't. Maybe they live in Auburn, maybe they don't. Maybe they live in Birmingham, maybe they don't. All you need to do is say, hey, look, here's a possibility. And this possibility shows that both these things could be true. Notice, it's not enough just to say maybe there's a bigger picture, but you have to actually draw a bigger picture that is possible. Now, it doesn't have to be the true bigger picture, but you have to at least show that there is a possible bigger picture, is the idea. So this means that there's two ways you can show that the existence of God and evil are consistent with one another. You can give one of the following. First, you could try to give a theodicy. That would be an attempt to identify the actual bigger picture, the actual reasons that a perfect God would allow evil to exist in our world. Or you can do something less. You can give a defense. This would be an attempt to identify some possible reasons that a perfect God would allow evil to exist. So a theodicy is like analogous to someone saying, hey, look, I know that the barber lives in Auburn. That's the actual location. A defense would say, look, I don't know where the barber lives, but it's possible that the barber lives in Auburn. And there you've drawn a possible bigger picture where both the beliefs are true. So resolving the logical problem requires that you at least give a defense. So you don't have to pretend to know what God's actual reasons are. Maybe that's impossible for us. And you also don't need to prove that God exists, but you can't just say that there's a greater good that makes these beliefs consistent. You have to show that it's possible that both belief in God and evil are true. You need to at least describe a possible situation. You need to give that actual possible bigger picture where God has reasons to allow evil. So can we find one example of a possible reason where God would allow an evil to exist? So remember, it's not enough to say that maybe the evil could lead to an even better result down the road. So one person's death right now leads to saving 1 million lives 100 years from now. Because even if that's possible, if a perfect God could achieve the same good result without going through the evil to get there, then a morally perfect God would prefer to create a world where that good result occurs without the evil. So for instance, I sometimes hear students say, so imagine that there's a school bus that crashes with 20 sort of children on board, and they all die. Now, someone might say, well, what possible reason could God possibly have for allowing that to happen? And sometimes they say, well, look, I'm not saying this is true, but maybe one of those kids was going to be the next Hitler that would have committed mass genocide. And by this bus sort of crashing, that evil is thereby prevented. That's the greater good that gives the possible reason that God would allow this evil to occur. That is not an acceptable defense, because that's not actually a possible reason that a perfect God could have for allowing that. Because notice, if God is all-powerful, God could have prevented that genocide without killing the other 19 kids. And so even if it does prevent that sort of greater sort of evil, it wouldn't justify a perfect God in allowing that evil, because they could have prevented that evil from happening without sort of this pain and suffering of the 20 kids dying on that bus. All right. God could have gotten the same results by lesser means, and a morally perfect God would want to get the same results by lesser means. So that's it for now. Next time, we're going to start looking at one of the most famous attempts to identify a possible greater good that would explain how a perfect God might create a world with evil in it.